The cop pointed his gun at Ronda Rousey and demanded that she undress right there at the gas station. He didn't know who was approaching them. A minute later, everything changed. Subscribe to the channel and right where you're watching this video from. The morning air lay cool over the vast openness of Southern California, carrying the dry breath of the desert across the cracked stretches of highway that cut through the land like faded scars. Ronda Rousey drove steadily, her hands loose but controlled on the steering wheel, the faint vibration of the road rising through the worn tires into her arms in a way she had grown to appreciate. The sky above was a canvas of pale blue, streaked with thin clouds like old brush marks, and the rising sun pressed gold along the ridges of distant hills, casting long shadows across the low brush that lined the roadside. Each mile hummed beneath her vehicle, a constant, patient reminder of the discipline she demanded of herself even in these quiet moments when there was no audience, no camera, no roar of a crowd to witness the stillness between her breaths. In her mind, the silence of the road became a form of meditation, one she had come to understand was necessary in a world that often confused noise for strength. She thought of the young women she had taught the previous day, their faces a blend of fear and fragile hope, shoulders tensed as they learned how to hold their ground, to trust the balance of their bodies, to use the earth beneath them as their ally. She remembered the way they flinched when instructed to break holds, the way they hesitated to grip firmly, their minds clouded by years of being told to shrink themselves to be acceptable, to be small, to be unthreatening. Ronda had seen this hesitation too many times, had seen how it cracked open in the wrong moment, leaving women exposed to the worst parts of the world. She passed a rusted sign for an old diner closed for good, the paint chipped and curling at the edges, the letters barely visible under layers of dust. There was something comforting in the permanence of its decay, the way it had surrendered to the sun without protest, without pretending to be what it was not. The radio in her vehicle was off, the hum of the tires the only sound joining the steady rhythm of her breath, her pulse a calm drum beneath her skin. She scanned the horizon with the eyes of someone who had learned to be ready for what could break the peace without warning, who understood that in the quietest moments, danger could arrive unannounced. A small service station came into view, its sign barely hanging above the flat roof, letters faded under the harsh sun, a single neon light flickering beneath a layer of dust. Two old pumps stood like weary sentinels in front of the building, and a crooked ice chest wheezed against the wall, its hum blending with the faint sigh of the breeze. Ronda guided her vehicle into the gravel lot, feeling the slight crunch beneath the tires as she eased it to a stop near the pumps, her eyes sweeping the space around her out of habit, marking exits, shadows, the potential for threat that could live even in places as still as this one. She stepped out of her vehicle with the casual grace of someone who had lived in her body fully, who understood the language of movement and how to hold presence without having to demand it. The air was cool against her skin as she stretched her arms, rolling her shoulders to ease the tightness that settled there after long hours of driving. She caught her reflection in the window of her vehicle for a moment, saw the serious set of her mouth, the clear, unflinching gaze that had stared down opponents in cages, in rings, in the silent spaces where violence had no referee to call time. Inside the service station, the lights flickered softly, the hum of an old refrigeration unit droning in the background, mixing with the sharp scent of stale coffee and something metallic that always seemed to hang in places like this. A teenage clerk stood behind the counter, his hair shaggy, eyes half-lidded as he scrolled through something on his phone, earbuds tucked in as if to close out the world around him. The space was nearly empty, except for the quiet presence of a man in a flannel shirt pouring coffee from a stained pot, his eyes blank, focused on the black liquid as it steamed into the chipped cup. Ronda moved with silent efficiency, gathering a bottle of water, a granola bar, and a small coffee that steamed faintly as she poured it herself, ignoring the way the teenage clerk barely looked up, the way the man in flannel glanced at her before returning to his cup. She felt the quiet tension that often lived in these small spaces, the undercurrent of people living lives they did not want, enduring routines that had worn grooves into their souls. She had once known that kind of silence, the kind that settled in the bones when you did not yet know how to fight back, before the ring had taught her that movement could be a language, that standing your ground could be a form of survival. She stepped back out into the brightness, the sun now higher, warming the pavement, the distant shimmer of heat beginning to dance above the blacktop of the highway. She leaned against her vehicle, sipping the bitter coffee, letting the heat settle into her skin, breathing in the dust and the faint scent of gasoline that clung to these places. There was no hurry in her, no need to rush back onto the road, only the quiet discipline that taught her to be present even in moments like these. She did not notice the police vehicle at first, the way it pulled in too quickly, tires skidding slightly over the gravel, stirring up small clouds of dust that caught the sunlight before settling again. It was the sound of the engine cutting sharply that drew her attention, the way the door opened with a quickness that betrayed urgency, the way the uniformed man stepped out with a stiffness that tried to mimic authority but smelled of insecurity. She watched him with calm eyes, marking the way his hand rested near the belt where his gun sat, the way his eyes scanned her, not with curiosity, but with a predatory interest that she had seen too often in men who wore their badges like shields against their own inadequacies. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform clean, but creased in a way that suggested too much time spent posing in front of mirrors, the polished badge on his chest catching the light in brief flashes as he moved. His eyes were hidden behind mirrored sunglasses, but the curl of his mouth told her enough about the kind of man he was, the way he enjoyed the weight of the authority he thought the uniform gave him. Another officer stepped out from the passenger side, shorter, with a face that looked like it had been carved from stone, eyes narrow, scanning the lot before settling on her, then flicking away with a practiced disinterest that could not quite hide the calculation in his gaze. They moved together, a practiced rhythm of intimidation, closing the space around her without urgency, speaking softly to each other, laughing in a way that suggested the private joke of power. Ronda stood her ground, the coffee cup in her hand warm against her skin, her eyes steady, her breathing calm, watching the way they moved, the way they tried to project control without realizing how transparent their fear made them. She felt the old, familiar coil of readiness settle into her spine, the quiet preparation that came before any fight, the way the world seemed to narrow and sharpen, the way the air felt heavier, waiting. They began with questions that were not questions, the kind that did not seek answers but compliance. Where are you going, ma'am? Why are you out here alone? Do you know how dangerous it is for someone like you to be traveling through these parts? Their voices carried the oily slickness of false concern, their eyes sharp, waiting for any sign of defiance, any flicker of fear. Ronda answered with silence, the calm weight of her presence more effective than any words could have been. She knew the power of silence, knew how it unsettled those who relied on fear to assert their control. They moved closer, one stepping into her space, the other circling slightly behind, trying to herd her, to box her in with their bodies and their arrogance. She could smell the faint tang of sweat under the cologne one of them wore, could hear the quiet creak of leather as they shifted, the faint rasp of breath as they prepared themselves to escalate. She felt no fear, only the calm clarity that had guided her through countless moments of conflict, the disciplined focus that had been carved into her through years of training and fighting. The taller officer reached out, his hand brushing against her arm in a gesture that was meant to seem casual, but was a test, a probe to see how far he could go. She did not flinch, did not step back, her eyes meeting his with a stillness that made him hesitate, the briefest flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before he covered it with a smirk. The other officer laughed softly behind her, the sound sharp and brittle in the morning air, the kind of laugh that belonged to men who thought cruelty was strength. They asked her to open the trunk of her vehicle, citing a routine check, their voices carrying the false authority of men who believed the uniform granted them the right to demand without justification. Ronda complied, moving with measured calm, noting the way their eyes followed her, the way their hands hovered near their belts, the way they shifted their weight, ready to react to any perceived defiance. She opened the trunk, stepping back, letting them peer inside, their eyes scanning her belongings with the casual disregard of those who took for granted the right to intrude. They made comments, small, cutting remarks about her gear, about her body, about women who thought they were tough, their words a thin veneer over the insecurity that oozed from their posture. Ronda listened without reaction, each word noted and filed away, her mind clear, her body relaxed but ready, the quiet coil of potential energy waiting beneath the surface. The taller officer let the trunk close with a thud that echoed in the stillness, stepping closer again, his eyes hidden but his intent clear. It was then that the air shifted, a subtle tightening as the officer's hand moved to his holster, fingers brushing over the grip of his gun, the tilt of his head changing, the smirk fading into something colder, something uglier. He stepped closer, his presence pressing against her like a weight, his voice lower now, the false veneer of concern gone, replaced by the sharp edge of threat. The other officer moved to block her retreat, the space around her closing in, the morning sun now high, casting harsh shadows across the gravel. Ronda felt the moment crystallize, the tension humming in the air, the faint tremor in the officer's fingers as he unbuttoned the strap over his gun, the way his breath caught as he prepared himself for the power he thought the weapon would give him. She stood still, her eyes locked on him, her breathing calm, her mind clear, ready for whatever would come, knowing that in the next few moments everything could change, and the road of silence would become the road of action. And as the officer's hand settled fully on the grip of his gun, his body shifting into the stance of someone about to exert the worst kind of power, Ronda felt the world narrow to a single point of focus, the quiet before the storm, the breath before the break, knowing that this was the moment everything she had trained for was meant to face. The sun rose higher, bleaching the sky to a relentless blue as the heat began to ripple across the asphalt, bending the air in silent waves. The officer's hand hovered with a practiced casualness over his weapon, the tilt of his body betraying the satisfaction of a predator who believed the hunt was his by right. The other officer flanked the space, boots scraping the gravel, shifting the weight of authority in measured steps as his shadow crossed the dry earth, joining the lengthening silhouette of the man with the gun. Ronda stood in the center of their orchestrated intimidation, the bitter taste of cheap coffee still on her tongue, her pulse calm, the memory of every controlled breath she had ever taken in the octagon, layering itself like quiet steel within her bones. The world had shrunk to the scent of warm dust, the faint oil of a service station left uncleaned for years. The slow rise of adrenaline that did not shake her hands but settled deep into her legs, coiling there with purpose. The officer's voice fell into a cold monotone, a command disguised as a threat, his eyes hidden behind mirrored lenses reflecting the unwavering stance of the woman who would not shrink. His finger brushed the edge of the trigger guard, a quiet promise of what he would do if she defied him. There was a smirk twisting his lips, the kind of smirk that belonged to those who had never been challenged, who believed a uniform and a badge could bend the world around them to their will. Ronda did not move, did not blink, the stillness in her a fortress built by the uncounted hours on the mat, the calluses on her hands, the bruises that had come and gone without ever teaching her the word surrender. She watched the man's breathing, the small flicker of nerves that betrayed itself in the corner of his jaw, the tension in his forearm, the illusion of control he clung to while the air tightened with his fear disguised as power. The crunch of tires on gravel did not belong in that silence, yet it came, weaving itself through the oppressive moment with the easy authority of something inevitable. The sound was not urgent, not aggressive, but steady, as if the driver had measured the road and decided upon his own time, unaffected by the tension that gripped the air of the service station. A truck, dusty from miles of travel, moved into view, its slow approach parting the space with the weight of a presence that had nothing to prove. It rolled to a gentle stop, engine idling for a moment before falling into a quiet that reclaimed the space, asserting that whatever was about to happen could wait for no one, not even for the illusions of authority that badges pinned to chests like shields made of tin. The door opened, and Chuck Norris stepped out with the calm of a man who understood exactly where his feet were placed upon the earth. The sun caught the lines on his face, carved there by years of discipline and quiet battles, by mornings that began before the world stirred and ended only when every task was complete. He wore the simplicity of his life in the denim of his jeans, the practicality of his boots, the open collar of a shirt that moved with him as he adjusted the angle of his worn cap against the light. There was no rush in his movement, no performance, only the controlled presence of someone who had lived enough to know when stillness was the sharpest blade of all. His eyes, sharp beneath the brim, swept across the scene, noting the drawn postures, the tension strung tight between the two officers and the woman standing with unbroken composure between them. He did not look at the guns first. He looked at the hands, the balance in the knees, the tension in the shoulders, reading the space as a craftsman reads the grain of wood before carving. He saw the camera lenses of bystanders, lifted with hesitant hands, the flicker of fear and curiosity in the eyes of a man pausing at the pumps, the mother pulling her child closer as she tried to decide if she should drive away or remain witness to what was unfolding. The air was thick with the scent of gasoline and the hot breath of the pavement, yet Chuck walked through it as if it were any other day, the steps of a man whose life had been built on the quiet readiness to move only when the moment demanded it. The officers noticed him belatedly, their gazes flicking toward him with annoyance and suspicion, the slight pivot of bodies' unspoken orders between men who believed they owned this ground. Chuck met their attention with the impassive calm that had once stared down opponents in tournament rings, the same calm that had held steady in situations where men shouted and threatened, and where real violence was seconds away, pressing against the skin like the promise of a storm. His hands remained at his sides, relaxed, not clenched, his chest rising and falling with an ease that did not match the tension of the moment, but rather commanded it to slow and measure itself against him. Ronda felt the moment shift, not as a rescue, but as an alignment, a reinforcement of the quiet power she already held within her stance. She recognized in Chuck the same disciplined restraint, the readiness that did not announce itself, but waited, unshaken, for the precise instant when action became necessary. There was no nod between them, no acknowledgement beyond the stillness that passed through the air, carrying with it the understanding of those who had lived through enough fights to know that the loudest man in the room was often the weakest. The taller officer adjusted his stance, irritated by the presence of the newcomer, the discomfort flickering across his posture even as he attempted to reassert control by shifting his gun, letting the weapon catch the light in a silent threat. Chuck's eyes dropped for a fraction of a second to the weapon, then back to the man's face, not as a challenge, but as a statement that he saw everything and would not be moved by it. The second officer flanked Chuck, circling with calculated caution, the weight of his boots pressing into the gravel as he sought an angle of advantage, the tension in his shoulders betraying the conflict between fear and the desire to dominate. The quiet hum of the desert returned, the breeze lifting the dry scent of earth, carrying it across the lot, pushing the heat against the skin without apology. The vehicles idled, the bystanders held their breath, the world pausing in the suspended space where the weight of potential violence settled like dust on everything. Chuck stood in it, the lines around his eyes deepening slightly as he surveyed the distance between himself and the officer with the gun, noting the slight tremor in the man's wrist, the sweat collecting along his hairline, the way his jaw clenched with the effort of maintaining the illusion of control. Time stretched in that silence, the air heavy with the unspoken realization that something was about to change. The officer with the gun, feeling the weight of the moment slipping from his grasp, shifted his feet, the gravel crunching sharply, his breath catching as he recalibrated the threat that Chuck's quiet presence had introduced. His finger adjusted near the trigger, the barrel of the weapon angling minutely as he sought to reaffirm the dominance he believed was his right to claim. Chuck's posture did not change, but the slight lowering of his chin, the subtle tightening of the lines around his eyes, spoke in a language older than the badge and the gun, a language carved by discipline and experience, a language that whispered of readiness without threat. The second officer, feeling the edge of that quiet authority, hesitated, his steps faltering as he glanced between his partner and the man who stood before them like a still point in the center of a storm that had not yet broken. Ronda watched the moment unfold, her breathing calm, her weight balanced, the fight within her held in careful suspension. She recognized the shift in the air, the thin crack in the illusion of the officer's authority, the way fear began to poison the confidence they had worn like armor. She felt no rush, no panic, only the quiet clarity that comes before movement, the certainty that every choice made now would shape the outcome. That control was the true currency of power, not the weapon shaken in the hand of a frightened man. The bystanders watched, their cameras recording, their eyes wide, the silence pressing down upon them as they witnessed the confrontation without the chaos they expected, without the shouting or the screaming that usually marked these moments. They saw a woman standing unbroken, a man standing calm, and two officers who found themselves facing something they could not intimidate, something they could not control with their badges and their weapons. Chuck's eyes did not leave the officer's face, the calm within them a quiet challenge to the violence that trembled on the edge of the man's posture. The officer swallowed, the muscles in his neck tightening, the reality of the cameras and the eyes upon him crawling across his skin, reminding him that his actions were no longer private, that the world would witness whatever he chose to do next. His partner shifted uneasily, the grip on his baton tightening, the silence stretching further as the weight of a decision pressed upon the moment. The sun bore down upon them, heating the air, shimmering on the metal of the vehicles, catching in the mirrored lenses of the officers' sunglasses, reflecting the image of a man who would not move, a woman who would not break, and a world that was waiting to see which would give way first. In that heavy silence, in the breath before the storm, the quiet authority of presence held dominion, and the illusion of power, held so tightly by those who believed they were untouchable, began to crack beneath the weight of calm that neither the badge nor the gun could command. Heat pulsed against the cracked pavement as the air settled into that moment when time seemed to hold its breath, pressing the scent of dust and old gasoline into the lungs of every bystander who had not yet decided whether they should run or keep their cameras lifted. The officer's hand trembled just once as it hovered over the grip of his gun, his reflection in his mirrored lenses catching the shape of Chuck Norris standing calmly before him, the faint breeze rustling the fabric of Chuck's worn shirt as if the world refused to move without his permission. Ronda Rousey stood a step to the side, the tension in her body a coiled readiness that hummed along her spine, her breathing steady, the quiet discipline of countless hours on the mat turning into the quiet authority she wore now, an invisible armor against the violence that threatened to erupt from the fear shaken in the man's hand. A car door slammed somewhere across the lot, a sound sharp and jarring in the silence, and the officer's finger twitched toward the trigger, his breath catching in a sound that did not belong to someone in control. Chuck did not flinch, did not shift, only allowed his eyes to narrow by the smallest measure as he observed the weakness crack the man's posture. The second officer's baton lifted, the air shimmering slightly around the motion, the shifting of his boots grinding gravel beneath heavy soles as he positioned himself, believing in the illusion of his advantage. The mother by the pump pulled her child closer, her wide eyes reflecting the scene, the small body pressed tightly against her leg, the child's face buried in the fabric of her jeans as if he understood, without being told, the shape of fear in the air. Time thinned until it was only the sound of the wind moving across the lot, the soft whir of a camera lens adjusting its focus, the faint hum of the refrigeration unit inside the store behind them. In that moment, the officer with the gun lifted his voice, a harsh sound scraping against the air, ordering compliance, his authority cracking as he tried to mask the desperation in his tone. The gun rose, not fully, but enough, the barrel dark against the morning light, the threat clear, trembling in the space it occupied, demanding submission. Ronda did not blink, her eyes on the weapon, not with fear, but with a precise calculation born of discipline, of understanding distance, of knowing the weight of timing. In that breath, as the officer's eyes flickered toward Chuck in a final attempt to measure the defiance in the older man's calm, Ronda moved. It was not the explosive chaos that many expected in moments like these, not the flailing panic of someone caught between survival and fear. Her movement was clean, efficient, the product of years of training that had stripped hesitation from her muscles. She stepped inside the officer's reach with a pivot that turned the barrel of the gun away from her center line, her left hand controlling the wrist as her right secured the weapon with a twist that bent the officer's arm in a direction it was not built to move. The weapon clattered to the pavement with a sound that cut the air, louder than the gasp of the officer, louder than the mother's quick cry, louder even than the exhale of the world around them as reality shifted. The officer's body bent under the pressure of the lock Ronda applied, her weight driving into the control, the scent of fear and sweat rising from him as his knees began to buckle. She did not look at his face, did not need to see the panic there. Her eyes locked instead on the barrel of the weapon as it lay on the pavement, ensuring it was clear, ensuring it was away from the reach of shaken hands that no longer controlled the moment. The second officer reacted, his baton swinging in an arc that aimed for the side of Ronda's head, but the movement was clumsy, telegraphed by the shifting of his hips and the tightening of his shoulders. Before the baton could find its mark, Chuck moved. His motion was deliberate, not rushed, stepping into the swing with the calm precision of a man who had built his life around understanding the geometry of combat. His hand intercepted the officer's wrist mid-swing, the impact a dull, controlled thud that traveled through the baton, through the officer's arm, up into his shoulder with the kind of shock that loosened fingers and forced them to open against their will. The baton fell, bouncing once before rolling toward the pumps, the officer's eyes wide with the sudden, disbelieving pain that moved up his arm like a burning wire. Chuck did not let go of the wrist, shifting his grip to control the elbow, turning the man's body with a movement that was almost gentle, guiding him to the ground in a controlled descent that left him on his knees, his face flushing with humiliation as he struggled to comprehend how easily his aggression had been turned against him. Chuck's face remained composed, his breathing even, the lines around his eyes deepening slightly as he ensured the officer's compliance without further harm, the control absolute, undeniable. The first officer tried to rise, rage breaking through the fear as he attempted to pull free from Ronda's hold, his free hand clawing toward her, fingers grasping for her throat, for her face, for anything to reassert the dominance that had been stripped from him. Ronda adjusted, shifting her weight, her hand sliding along his forearm, pressing into the nerve clusters near the elbow, forcing his hand open, forcing his body down, his chest hitting the ground with a heavy exhale as his breath left him, the gravel biting into his skin, grounding him in the reality that power did not belong to those who abused it, but to those who controlled themselves. A third officer, one who had remained by the patrol vehicle, stepped forward now, hand reaching for his belt where another baton rested, his eyes darting between Chuck and Ronda, calculating, weighing the risks against the anger that surged through him at the sight of his fellow officers on the ground. His hand closed around the baton, lifting it with the promise of violence, his stance shifting as he prepared to charge. Ronda saw him, her eyes narrowing as she judged the distance, the time it would take him to reach her, the angle at which he would swing. She felt the energy settle into her legs, the readiness to move, to meet force with control. But Chuck was closer. His movement was a blur only in its efficiency, stepping into the path of the charging officer, his hand lifting to catch the baton at the apex of its arc, his other hand pressing into the officer's chest with an open palm that halted the forward momentum with a force that was immovable. The officer's eyes widened, the breath leaving him in a sharp gasp as the reality of resistance met the illusion of aggression, the baton falling from his fingers as his knees buckled, the shock of controlled force grounding him as he collapsed forward, caught by Chuck's guiding hand that eased him to the ground without further injury. The lot was silent except for the heavy breathing of the officers on the ground, the quiet, controlled breaths of Chuck and Ronda, and the muffled sounds of a child crying softly into his mother's jeans. The bystanders, who had at first lifted their cameras with the expectation of chaos, of violence, of blood, now recorded the aftermath of control, the stillness that followed the storm, the clear evidence that real strength did not need to shout to be heard. The weapons lay scattered on the ground, untouched, abandoned by the hands that had once held them with shaking authority, and the weight of the moment settled upon the shoulders of every witness who understood that they had seen something different, something that defied the narrative of fear and escalation that had played out so many times before. Ronda stood slowly, stepping back from the officer who now lay breathing heavily on the ground, his face pressed against the gravel, the reality of his defeat settling into his bones with the heat of the sun. She did not gloat, did not smile, did not allow herself the indulgence of triumph. Instead, she took a steadying breath, feeling the adrenaline settle back into the calm discipline that lived within her, the readiness that would always remain, waiting for the next moment it would be needed. She glanced at Chuck, their eyes meeting in a quiet exchange that spoke of understanding, of shared values, of the knowledge that what they had done was necessary, but that it was not glory they sought, only the restoration of dignity where it had been threatened. Chuck nodded once, the lines around his eyes softening as he released the last officer's wrist, stepping back to allow the man to find his own way to his knees, to his feet, to the understanding that the uniform he wore did not make him untouchable, that the badge on his chest did not grant him the right to abuse others without consequence. The officers stood slowly, unsteady, their eyes lowered, their breathing labored as the dust of the lot settled around them, their weapons untouched, their authority cracked open for the world to see. The bystanders lowered their phones, the silence shifting as whispers began, as people stepped forward to check on one another, to offer comfort where fear had taken root. A man stepped from behind a pump, nodding silently to Chuck and Ronda, his eyes wide with gratitude, with the quiet awe of someone who had witnessed the truth that control was stronger than violence. The mother lifted her child, holding him close, whispering words of comfort into his hair as she glanced at Ronda with tear-bright eyes, the silent thank you carried in the tremor of her chin. Chuck and Ronda stood in the center of it all, the calm after the storm, the witnesses to the reality that power did not come from the threat of violence, but from the control that could stop it, from the discipline that could redirect it, from the presence that could hold the line without the need to cross it. The sun moved higher, casting long shadows behind them, stretching across the lot where the weapons still lay, untouched, as a reminder to those who had once held them that the world was watching, and that silence, when held with purpose, could break the system louder than any scream ever could. The air over the lot remained heavy with the scent of dust and heat, the shimmering breath of the California sun pressing down upon the cracked pavement where the weapons lay untouched, scattered like discarded illusions of power. The people who had gathered to witness the confrontation stood in a quiet circle around the space, their phones still raised, though the urgency with which they had recorded the chaos had shifted into something softer, something marked by reverence and a cautious hope that what they had seen was real. The officers, who had believed in their invincibility, now stood on the fringes of the gathering, their badges dull in the unforgiving light, their breathing unsteady, their eyes unable to meet those of the people they had attempted to dominate only moments before. Ronda Rousey felt the last tremors of adrenaline settle beneath her skin, absorbed into the practiced calm that she carried within her like a hidden flame, always ready, never seeking permission to burn unless the moment demanded it. She stepped back, allowing the space to open around her, her gaze sweeping over the crowd with the instinct of someone who had spent her life reading rooms, learning the silent language of tension and the subtleties of fear. There was no triumph in her eyes, only the steady presence of someone who had acted out of necessity, not for glory, and who understood that the true measure of strength was in the restraint that allowed dignity to remain unbroken, even when chaos called for destruction. Chuck Norris adjusted the brim of his hat against the glare of the sun, the lines on his face deepening with the quiet gravity of a man who had lived long enough to know that victories worth having were never loud, that the most important battles left no one cheering but instead left the world breathing a little easier, if only for a moment. His eyes moved from the officers, who now shifted uncomfortably under the weight of their own actions, to the bystanders, who held their children closer, who whispered to one another with cautious relief that they had seen something different today, something that challenged the quiet fear that had wrapped around their daily lives, convincing them that some people were beyond accountability. A man approached cautiously, his hands held in front of him as if afraid to interrupt the silence that had settled over the lot. His face was lined with the weariness of hard days, the kind of tiredness that came from living with the knowledge that the world did not always offer protection to those who needed it most. He nodded to Chuck first, a brief, grateful gesture, before turning to Ronda with eyes that glistened, though no tears fell. She inclined her head in acknowledgement, recognizing the unspoken words that lay between them, the gratitude for a moment of safety delivered not with violence, but with precision and control. The officers remained, their weapons still lying where they had fallen, the badges on their chests feeling heavier with each passing second, each whispered comment from the crowd chipping away at the illusion of their authority. One of them, the one who had raised his gun to Ronda, bent slowly, his hand shaking as he reached for the weapon. His fingers hovered above it, trembling, before he pulled back, leaving it on the ground, as if touching it would confirm to the world and to himself that he was not yet ready to carry it again. His partner placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that felt empty in the bright glare of accountability, the weight of cameras and eyes capturing every moment, preserving it beyond denial. Ronda moved toward the weapon, her steps measured, her posture calm, and she bent to pick it up, her hand wrapping around the grip with the ease of someone who understood its weight not as a tool of fear, but as an object that could only hold power if granted permission to do so. She held it carefully, her fingers positioned away from the trigger, and extended it back to the officer with the quiet dignity of a teacher returning a lesson to a student who had not yet learned it fully. The officer's eyes lifted, meeting hers for the first time, and in that meeting was the reflection of everything that had just occurred. The fear, the loss of control, the reality that authority did not live in a badge or a weapon, but in the ability to stand in the truth of one's actions. He took the weapon, his hands shaken, and lowered his gaze, stepping back to where the others stood, the line of officers who had once arrived with the expectation of submission, now reduced to the silence of those who had been shown a mirror they could not avoid. Chuck watched them, his expression unreadable, his silence holding the space between them like a judgment, not of their worth as men, but of their choices in that moment, of the ease with which they had allowed fear to guide their hands toward violence. A child's voice broke the quiet, small and uncertain, asking his mother if the bad men would hurt them again. The mother bent, lifting the boy into her arms, pressing his face against her neck as she whispered words of comfort that even she did not fully believe. Her eyes lifting to Ronda and Chuck with the question she could not ask out loud. Would they always be there, ready to intervene when power forgot its purpose? Ronda met her gaze, offering a small nod, not as a promise, but as a reassurance that strength, when it was real, did not walk away from its responsibility. That presence itself could be enough to remind those who abused power that the world was watching. The crowd began to disperse slowly, the spell of the moment breaking as people returned to their cars, their routines, their lives, each of them carrying with them the memory of what they had witnessed, the image of control exercised without brutality, of violence averted by discipline, of a confrontation that had ended not with blood, but with a lesson delivered in the quiet power of those who understood the value of restraint. Phones were lowered, though not turned off, the footage already moving through the networks of social media, spreading like ripples across a pond, each viewer seeing in it what they needed: a reminder of accountability, a call for justice, a story of hope in a world that had learned to expect disappointment. The officers remained by their vehicles, gathering their weapons with slow, deliberate motions, the weight of the eyes that had watched them heavy upon their shoulders. They spoke in low voices, glancing occasionally at Chuck and Rhonda, who stood together in the middle of the lot, the sun behind them casting long shadows across the ground where the confrontation had unfolded. There was no need for words between them, no victory to declare, no point to prove, only the quiet understanding that they had done what needed to be done, not for glory, but because it was right. Chuck turned to Rhonda, his eyes reflecting the sun's harsh light, and gave a single nod before stepping toward his truck, his steps steady, each movement deliberate, each breath even. Rhonda remained for a moment longer, her eyes sweeping the lot, the people who remained, the officers, who now avoided her gaze, and then she too turned, moving toward her vehicle with the calm certainty of someone who had fulfilled her purpose, leaving behind the echoes of a lesson that would not soon be forgotten. As the engines of their vehicles started, the sound low and steady, the last of the bystanders lowered their phones, watching as the two figures drove away, leaving behind not chaos, but a silence filled with the promise of change, the hope that what had been seen could not be unseen, that what had been learned would not be forgotten. The officers remained, their reflections in the dusty windows of their cars showing them a truth they could not escape, the memory of the moment etched into their minds as a reminder that authority was a responsibility, not a right, and that power, when wielded without control, could be stripped away in the quiet presence of those who understood its true purpose. Rhonda's hands remained steady on the wheel as she guided her vehicle back onto the highway, the wind catching strands of her hair, pulling them across her face as she drove. Her mind was calm, the tension of the encounter settling into the deep place within her where it would be examined later, not as a source of trauma, but as another moment that confirmed the necessity of her purpose, the importance of her presence in a world that often forgot that strength was not the same as violence. The road stretched before her, long and winding, the horizon a line of promise beneath the vast expanse of blue, the silence around her not empty, but filled with the quiet certainty that she would continue, that she would be ready, that she would not stand aside when the moment came again. Chuck drove in the opposite direction, the road unfolding beneath his tires in the slow, patient rhythm of a journey that had no need for urgency. The land rolled out around him, the colors of the earth shifting from the pale yellows of dry grass to the deeper browns of the hills, the scent of sage carried on the breeze that slipped through the open window. His thoughts moved with the rhythm of the road, the memory of the confrontation already folded into the long ledger of moments that had defined his life, moments where silence had spoken louder than words, where presence had prevented violence, where control had been the measure of strength. They drove away from the lot where silence had broken the illusion of power, where the world had seen what it meant to stand without fear, to act without aggression, to hold the line without crossing it. They left behind the officers who would carry the weight of their choices, the bystanders who would remember the moment they had witnessed strength in its truest form, the quiet presence of those who understood that justice, when it was real, did not need to shout to be heard. The sun moved across the sky, casting light over the roads that stretched ahead, roads that would carry them to new places, to new moments where their presence would be needed, where silence would once again become the language through which power was held accountable, and where the quiet promise of their actions would remind the world that strength, when tempered with discipline, could be the force that changed everything. The road behind them became a memory, not marked by the violence that so many had expected, but by the silence that had followed. A silence filled with the weight of understanding and the hope that it might change something, even if just for a while. The footage of the confrontation spread quickly, carried by the hands of those who had stood trembling at the pumps, by the voices of those who whispered to each other as they returned to their cars, by the quiet determination of those who had lifted their phones, not out of a desire for spectacle, but out of the fear that if they did not, the truth would be buried under official words that would rewrite the narrative into something it had never been. In homes, on sidewalks, in schools and offices, people watched the moment again and again, saw Ronda's calm precision, Chuck's measured steps, the officer's weapons falling to the ground like symbols of an authority that had been challenged and found wanting. They watched the officers stand and afterward, their hands empty, their faces lowered, their badges heavy, and they saw in that moment the possibility that accountability was not a myth, that control was not the same as domination, that presence could be stronger than the loudest threats. Ronda returned to her training space, the small gym where the scent of sweat and determination hung in the air, where the mats were worn but clean, where young women found themselves learning not just how to defend their bodies, but how to claim space without apology. The day after the incident, the gym was fuller than usual, a quiet buzz in the air as girls and women tied back their hair, adjusted the straps on their gloves, and looked at Ronda with a new kind of focus in their eyes. Some of them had seen the footage, some had heard it from friends, or seen fragments replayed across their social feeds. The clip of Ronda stepping into the officer's space, disarming him with the efficiency of someone who understood that violence did not need to be met with more violence, that control could be the sharpest blade of all. They did not ask her to explain, did not crowd her with questions, but she could see it in their posture as they stretched, as they prepared for drills, the way their shoulders settled a little lower, the way their chins lifted, the way they met her gaze and did not look away. She moved through the drills with them, her voice calm, her instructions clear, demonstrating the angles of balance, the pivot of the hips that gave power to a movement without wasting energy, the placement of a hand that could redirect an opponent's strength without allowing it to become harm. She reminded them that they were not there to become violent, but to become ready, that they were not there to learn to hurt others, but to ensure that others could not hurt them without consequence. As they practiced, some of them stumbling, some of them laughing at themselves, some of them moving with the focused silence of those who understood the stakes, Ronda moved among them, adjusting a stance here, correcting a grip there, the memory of the officer's trembling hand on his weapon a quiet reminder that fear was never the right foundation for strength. In the evenings, when the gym emptied and the mats were rolled away, Ronda sat on the edge of the ring, her hands resting on her knees, her breathing slow and deep, allowing the silence to settle around her. She did not replay the confrontation for herself, did not need to relive the moment to understand what it meant, but she allowed herself to acknowledge the weight of it, the reality that even in control, there was always the risk of escalation, that every movement carried the potential to change a life forever, for better or for worse. She thought of the faces of the officers afterward, the shame that had replaced their anger, the confusion that had replaced their certainty, and she hoped that somewhere in that discomfort was the seed of a lesson learned, that the next time they reached for power, they would remember the feeling of standing empty-handed under the gaze of those they had tried to control. Chuck returned to his quiet routine, rising early to train before the sun lifted fully over the horizon, the air still cool against his skin as he moved through forms that had become a language of their own, a silent conversation between breath and balance, between intention and stillness. The dojo was small, tucked behind an unassuming storefront, the windows covered in paper to keep out the glare of the morning light, the floor swept clean before each class, the scent of the wood and the faint tang of the mats familiar and grounding. His students, a mix of ages and backgrounds, gathered as they always did, bowing as they entered, finding their places on the floor with the quiet respect that was the foundation of every lesson he taught. They had seen the footage, too, though few spoke of it, the questions in their eyes clear as they watched him demonstrate the simplest movements, the steps that built into techniques, the transitions that required awareness rather than brute strength. Chuck did not address it directly, did not allow the moment to become a spectacle within the walls of the dojo, but he allowed the lesson of it to permeate the air, reminding his students with each movement that the goal was not domination but understanding, that the purpose of training was not to win but to remain steady when others sought to create chaos. The youngest students watched him with wide eyes as he explained the importance of breathing, of maintaining focus, of not allowing fear to dictate action, their small hands mimicking the movements, their laughter ringing out when they stumbled, their determination returning as they tried again. After the classes, Chuck would stand by the door as the students left, bowing to each of them, offering a word of encouragement, a reminder to practice patience, to respect their parents, to remember that strength was not loud, that it did not need to be seen to be real. The parents who came to collect their children met his gaze with gratitude, some of them offering quiet thanks, some of them sharing that they had seen what had happened, that they were grateful their children were learning from someone who understood the value of control. Chuck would nod, offering a small smile, accepting their words without allowing them to become a burden, knowing that his role was not to be a hero in their eyes, but to remain a steady presence in a world that too often valued noise over substance. The footage continued to ripple outward, finding its way into news segments where anchors debated the implications of what had happened, where analysts discussed the necessity of reform, where commentators argued over the meaning of strength and the definition of accountability. Some tried to frame it as a confrontation that could have gone wrong, a narrow avoidance of tragedy, while others saw it as a moment of hope, a demonstration that presence and discipline could diffuse a situation that might otherwise have ended in violence. The discussions rose and fell with the news cycle, but the images remained. Ronda stepping into the officer's space with calm certainty, Chuck intercepting the baton with the ease of someone who understood the weight of consequences, the officers standing afterward, their weapons on the ground, their hands empty, their authority questioned not by aggression but by control. For some, the footage became a lesson shared in classrooms, played for students who were learning about justice, about the power dynamics between citizens and those entrusted to protect them, about the importance of accountability and the danger of fear disguised as authority. For others, it was a reminder that the world could change, even if only for a moment, that the narrative of power could be rewritten by those who were willing to stand without aggression, who were willing to intervene without escalation, who understood that silence, when paired with presence, could speak louder than any threat. In the quiet moments of the evening, as the sun lowered and the air cooled, Ronda would sometimes step outside the gym, the sounds of the city softening into the distance, the hum of traffic becoming a distant backdrop to her thoughts. She would stand there, letting the breeze brush against her skin, the scent of the night air reminding her that the world continued, that each day brought new challenges, that the work was never truly finished. She would think of the young women inside, of their determination, of the way they looked at her with hope, with trust, and she would remind herself that every moment she chose to stand, to remain calm, to act without aggression, was a moment that taught them to do the same. Chuck, in his own space, would sit quietly in the dojo after the last student had left, the floor cool beneath him, the scent of the wood grounding him in the present. He would allow himself a moment to close his eyes, to breathe deeply, to acknowledge the weight of the role he played, not as a hero, but as a guide, as someone who could teach others to remain steady in a world that often demanded reaction rather than reflection. He would think of the officers, of the lesson that had been delivered without words, and he would hope that somewhere within them the discomfort they felt would grow into understanding, that the fear they had wielded like a weapon would transform into a commitment to serve with integrity. The world did not change overnight, and neither Ronda nor Chuck expected it to. They knew that the work continued, that the moments of silence they had created in the face of aggression were not the end, but the beginning, that the ripples from that day would move outward, touching lives in ways they would never fully see or understand. But they also knew that presence mattered, that control was a form of strength that could not be taken away, that discipline was a shield stronger than any weapon, and that the quiet promise of their actions would remain, reminding the world that true power did not need to shout to be heard, that it did not need to harm to prove its worth. And so, as the nights came and went, as the footage continued to circulate, as the conversations rose and fell, Ronda and Chuck continued their work, each in their own space, each carrying the quiet certainty that they would stand again when the moment came, that they would remain calm when others sought chaos, that they would teach by example that the strength to remain steady was the greatest strength of all. If this story meant something to you, subscribe for more. Share this video with someone who needs to see it, and check out our other stories next.